I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The sound of my life being bartered away was not a crash of thunder, but the dry rustle of my father's papers and the clink of my stepmother's sherry glass against its saucer. It was a quiet, domestic sound, the kind of sound that underscores the most profound betrayals. "Eleanor," my stepmother Beatrice said, her voice thin and sharp like a pinprick. "What is to be done with Eleanor? Rosamond is our triumph, but the other one, she is an anchor, Thomas, a quiet, heavy anchor." My father sighed, a sound I knew well. It was the sound of weary capitulation. "She is a good girl, Beatrice. Quiet, yes, but good." "Goodness does not pay the butcher," she retorted, "nor does it keep a roof over our heads. She has no dowry to speak of, no dazzling beauty. She sits with her books as if they will somehow conjure a husband from their pages. We must be practical. My cousin, the Dowager Lady Danbury, requires a companion. It is a dreary post in a dreary corner of Northumberland. But it is a post. It would be a solution." I stood in the hall, my hand frozen on the porcelain doorknob. The cool, smooth surface a stark contrast to the frantic hammering in my chest. A solution. I was not a daughter. I was a problem to be solved, a ledger entry to be balanced. Beside me, on the hall table, sat a vase of roses, their velvet petals lush and pink. They were for Rosamond, of course. Everything beautiful was for Rosamond. My older sister was a living rose, all vibrant colour and intoxicating fragrance, destined for the finest crystal vase in the grandest of drawing rooms. I was the sprig of lavender, tucked away in a linen drawer, useful for staving off moths, but never intended for display. I did not resent Rosamond her beauty. I resented the world for being blind to anything else. The catalyst for this final grim calculation was, as always, money, or rather, the spectacular lack of it. My father, a man whose kindness was matched only by his financial ineptitude, had gambled away the last of our respectable fortune. Our London house was forfeit, our staff dismissed, our future a terrifyingly blank page. The only asset we had left was Rosamond's face. And so a plan was hatched, whispered over dwindling fires in our soon-to-be-lost home. We were to retreat to our last remaining property, a modest and slightly damp country house named Ferngrove, which had the sole virtue of being situated a mere 5 miles from Blackwood Manor, the ancestral seat of the Duke of Alastair. The Duke was a legend, a creature of myth more than a man. Lord Julian Croft, the Duke of Alastair, was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. He was impossibly wealthy, possessor of a title that stretched back to the Norman Conquest, and, most importantly, a widower. His wife had died some years before, a tragic, fleeting illness, and he had since remained in self-imposed exile at his country estate, a dark star around which the local society nervously orbited. He was said to be severe, cold, and utterly uninterested in the frivolities of the world. He was the perfect, unattainable prize, and my family intended to capture him with Rosamond as their glittering bait. I was to be part of the baggage, a shadow clinging to the hem of my sister's brilliant gown, instructed to be silent, unobtrusive, and as invisible as possible. It was a role I had been practicing for my entire life. Our arrival at Ferngrove was a study in diminished expectations. The house smelled of damp stone and regret. My room was in the north wing, a small, cold chamber with a window that overlooked a perpetually weeping willow tree. It was there that I unpacked my books, my only true companions, lining them up on the rickety shelf like soldiers preparing for a long siege. They were my shield and my solace, a world of thought and feeling that existed beyond the narrow confines of my life. The campaign to ensnare the Duke began with a calculated assault on the local society. My stepmother secured an invitation to the Autumn Assembly, a modest affair held in the nearby town. Rosamond was poured into a gown of celestial blue, her golden hair intricately dressed, her smile a dazzling weapon. I wore a simple grey muslin, a dress that announced my status as a background character more effectively than any words. My task was simple: to hold Rosamond's shawl, to fade into the wallpaper, to not exist too loudly. He arrived late, a slash of black in the chattering, pastel-hued room. The Duke of Alistair was taller than I had imagined, with dark hair and a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. He did not smile. He did not mingle. He stood near the entrance with his host, his presence sucking the air from the room, turning cheerful chatter into nervous whispers. I watched him from my corner, my usual post of detached observation. He looked like a man carrying an immense weight, his shoulders straight with the effort of it. Grief, I thought, had made a permanent home in the stern lines of his mouth. My stepmother, ever the strategist, guided Rosamond on a slow, deliberate path that would inevitably cross his. It was at that precise moment that chaos, in the form of a clumsy young footman, intervened. A tray of wine glasses, carried with more hope than skill, tilted precariously. I saw it happen in slow motion. The footman's lurch, the crimson arc of the wine, the collective gasp of the crowd. It was headed directly for the mayor's wife, a woman of formidable size and even more formidable temperament. Without thinking, I moved. I stepped forward, catching the edge of the tray, my hand shooting out to steady the falling glasses. Most were saved, but one glass shattered on the floor, and a splash of red wine soaked the sleeve of my grey dress. A sudden, shocking bloom of colour. A hush fell. The footman was stammering apologies. The mayor's wife was fanning herself in alarm, and I was suddenly, horribly, the centre of attention. I knelt to help the poor boy gather the shards of glass, murmuring that it was no matter, a complete accident. And then I felt a shadow fall over me. I looked up, and he was there. The Duke of Alistair was standing directly in front of me, looking down not at the mess, not at the horrified footman, but at me. It was the gaze that undid me. It was not a glance, not the polite sweep of the eyes that one gives to a piece of furniture. It was a direct, focused, and unnervingly thorough look. His eyes, the colour of a winter storm, were not cold as I had expected. They were analytical. They took in the wine stain on my sleeve, my hands carefully picking up the broken glass, and then they met my own. For a long, silent moment, the noise of the assembly room faded to a dull hum. In that look, I felt seen, not as the plain sister, not as the quiet chaperone, but as a person, separate and distinct. It was as if he had peeled back the layers of my invisibility with nothing more than his attention. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away without a word, leaving me kneeling on the floor with a piece of broken crystal in my hand and a strange, unfamiliar heat spreading through my chest. The social script had been utterly and irrevocably broken. The Duke's gaze at the assembly became a seed of discord in our household. Beatrice was furious. "He was meant to see Rosamond!" she hissed at me later that evening, her face pinched with frustration. "Not you, making a spectacle of yourself with the servants!" Rosamond, to her credit, defended me. "She prevented a disaster, Mamma. It was quite clever of her." But the damage was done. A fissure had appeared in their carefully constructed plan. We had assumed the incident would be the end of it, a strange, momentary aberration. But a few days later, the Duke's carriage, a severe black-lacquered vehicle pulled by two magnificent matching greys, rolled up the gravel drive of Ferngrove. The arrival sent our small household into a panic. Beatrice smoothed her dress a dozen times. Rosamond was pinched into rosy-cheeked perfection, and I was instructed to make myself scarce after the initial introductions. The drawing room was prepared, the best tea service brought out from its tissue paper wrapping. He was shown in, a formidable presence in the cramped, slightly shabby room. He offered polite, formal greetings, his eyes scanning the space with an unreadable expression. He accepted a cup of tea, his conversation with my father and stepmother stilted and sparse. Rosamond, prompted by Beatrice, spoke of London fashion and the latest novels, her voice a light, melodic counterpoint to his deep, resonant baritone. I sat on a small chair near the window, my needlework in my lap, fulfilling my duty of being silent and decorative like a potted fern. But then he turned his head, his gaze cutting straight through Rosamond's chatter to land on me. "Miss Vance," he said, and the use of my name, a name so rarely spoken with any weight, was a small shock. "I notice you have a copy of Thompson's Essays on Agriculture, an unusual choice for a young lady." All eyes swung to me. The book in question was on a small table beside my chair. I felt a flush creep up my neck. "I find his theories on crop rotation and soil management compelling, Your Grace." Beatrice let out a small, tittering laugh, a sound meant to dismiss my comment as a girlish absurdity. "Oh, Eleanor and her dusty old books. She has the strangest interests." The Duke did not smile. He simply held my gaze. "I do not find them strange," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable authority that silenced the room. "I find them practical. My estate manager and I were debating Thompson's proposal on fallow fields only yesterday." The conversation shifted, or rather, he shifted it. He directed several more questions to me about the book, about other authors, about my thoughts on the local landscape. Each question was precise, intelligent, and utterly devoid of the usual social pleasantries. It was a conversation of minds, a thing I had only ever experienced with my books. Rosamond sat in beautiful silence, her prepared remarks useless. Beatrice's smile became a brittle, fixed thing. I felt as though I were walking a tightrope, terrified of falling, yet exhilarated by the height. When he finally stood to leave, he gave a formal bow to my stepmother and Rosamond, but his final look was for me. It was that same intense, analytical gaze from the assembly, a look that seemed to be taking my measure and, for some inexplicable reason, finding it adequate. His visits became a regular, confounding occurrence. He would call twice a week, always under the guise of neighbourly courtesy, and each time the strange ritual would repeat. He would endure the polite conversation with the others, and then, with surgical precision, he would find a way to speak with me. One afternoon, he found me in the neglected garden, attempting to tame a wildly overgrown rosebush. He dismissed my flustered apology for my dirt-stained hands with a wave. "There is more honesty in a gardener's hands than in any London salon, Miss Vance," he remarked, and then proceeded to discuss the finer points of pruning with a knowledge that surprised me. He saw the world not as a backdrop for social manoeuvring, but as a complex system of cause and effect, of growth and decay, a perspective that mirrored my own. The first gift arrived on a bitterly cold Tuesday in November. A cart pulled up to the house, laden with a quantity of perfectly seasoned oak firewood, enough to last the entire winter. The driver had no note, only instructions that it was for Ferngrove. My father was bewildered, Beatrice suspicious. "It must be a gesture," she declared. "A grand gesture for Rosamond." But I knew my room was the coldest in the house, that I often sat huddled in a shawl, my fingers too numb to turn the pages of my book. The wood was not a grand gesture. It was a practical, thoughtful kindness. It was an act of observation. A week later, a box arrived from a London modiste. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a shawl. It was not a flimsy, fashionable thing, but a thick, heavy cashmere of the deepest forest green, incredibly soft and warm. There was no card. Rosamond declared it must be for her, though the colour did nothing for her complexion. Beatrice pronounced it a clear sign of the Duke's intentions. But when my stepmother tried to claim it, I found a strength I did not know I possessed. "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I believe it is for me." I took the shawl and retreated to my room, wrapping it around my shoulders. It felt like an embrace. It felt like a secret. I began to live for his visits, for those small, stolen moments of real conversation. The drawing room became a stage where I felt both the lead actress and the most terrified member of the audience. The tension was a constant, shimmering presence. One afternoon, he brought a book for me, a rare edition of pastoral poetry he had mentioned in a previous conversation. He had found it in his library and thought I might appreciate it. As he handed it to me, our fingers brushed. It was the briefest of touches, skin against skin, but a jolt went through me, sharp and clean as lightning. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, awareness, before he pulled his hand back. We stood in silence for a moment, the air thick with unspoken things. The book felt impossibly heavy in my hands. The turning point, the moment the subtext became text, occurred during a walk. Beatrice, hoping to encourage a proposal, had reluctantly agreed to let me accompany Rosamond and the Duke on a chaperoned walk around the estate's small, sad lake. She walked ahead with Rosamond, her voice carrying back on the crisp air. The Duke deliberately slowed his pace to fall in step with me. We walked in silence for some time, the crunch of fallen leaves under our feet the only sound. Then he spoke, his voice low. "Miss Vance," he began, then paused. "Eleanor, I find the constant formality between us a hindrance to honest conversation, an impediment I am no longer willing to tolerate. I would be honoured if you would call me Julian." My heart stopped. In our world of rigid etiquette, the use of a given name was a declaration. It was an act of intimacy more profound than a stolen kiss. I could feel the blood rush to my cheeks. "Your Grace," I stammered, falling back on the familiar, safe address. "Julian," he corrected gently, his eyes fixed on my face. I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. "Julian," I whispered. The name felt foreign, and yet perfectly right on my tongue. It was a key turning in a lock I had not known was there, opening a door into a room I had only ever dreamed of entering. Ahead of us, my stepmother glanced back, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning fury. But for the first time, her anger seemed small and distant, a storm on a far horizon. A new one was brewing much closer, within the very walls of my own heart. This fragile, burgeoning hope was a delicate thing, a hothouse flower cultivated in the chilly atmosphere of Ferngrove. I nurtured it in the quiet of my room, warmed by the anonymous firewood and wrapped in the secret softness of my green shawl. Julian's visits continued, and with the barrier of formality now breached, our conversations deepened. We spoke of philosophy, of history, of the burdens of duty and the solace of solitude. I felt my mind, so long kept under wraps, stretching and unfurling like a fern in the spring sun. I was beginning to believe in the unbelievable, that this remarkable man saw me, Eleanor Vance, and valued what he saw. The blow, when it came, was swift and brutal. It arrived not with a shout, but in the form of a piece of paper left carelessly on my father's desk. He had been agitated for days, drinking more than usual, his face etched with a familiar, haunted look of financial panic. One evening, I passed his study and found the door ajar, the room empty. A single letter lay open on the blotter, illuminated by the dying light from the window. A sense of dread, cold and sharp, propelled me into the room. My hand trembled as I picked it up. The letter was not a letter at all. It was a draft of a contract. The dense, legalistic script was difficult to pass, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. It was an agreement between my father, Thomas Vance, and Julian Croft, the Duke of Alastair. It detailed my father's colossal, ruinous debts owed, through a series of inherited loans, directly to the Duke's estate. And it outlined the settlement. In exchange for the complete forgiveness of this debt, my father would deliver the hand of his eldest daughter, Rosamond Vance, in marriage. I read it once, twice, a third time, the words blurring into a black smudge of ink. Every kindness, every thoughtful gesture, every intense gaze was instantly and poisonously recontextualized. He was not a suitor. He was a creditor. His visits were not courtship. They were inspections. He was not seeing me. He was assessing the family he was being forced to acquire. The firewood, the shawl, the books, they were not gifts. They were investments. Small expenditures to smooth the path of a distasteful but necessary business transaction. The intellectual connection I had treasured was nothing more than a landlord surveying the fixtures of a property he was about to possess. Humiliation washed over me in a hot, sickening wave. I was a fool. A naive, bookish fool who had mistaken a calculated business strategy for genuine affection. I had built a castle of hope on a foundation of lies, and now it had crumbled into dust, burying me in its wreckage. I fled to my room, the contract clutched in my hand, and threw the green shawl into the back of my wardrobe as if it were on fire. The warmth it had once offered now felt like the heat of a brand, marking me as the property of a man who had purchased my family's dignity. The next time he called, I sent word that I was unwell, and the time after that. Gifts began to arrive. A small, exquisitely carved wooden horse, a collection of poetry, a basket of hothouse grapes. I did not open them. I instructed the maid to return them to the Duke's messenger unopened, with a cool, formal note stating that Miss Vance was unable to accept them. Let him think me rude. Let him think me ungrateful. It was better than him knowing the truth, that my heart was shattered. After the third returned package, he came himself. He did not send a footman to the door. He strode up the path and knocked, the sound echoing through the quiet house like a judgment. I was in the small derelict cottage at the edge of the woods, my only true sanctuary, when I saw him coming. I had gone there to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house, to be alone with my misery. There was nowhere to run. He found me there, standing in the dusty, sun-streaked interior. He looked at my face, at the paleness of my cheeks and the dark circles under my eyes, and his own face hardened with concern. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, "why are you avoiding me? Why do you return my gifts?" I lifted my chin, steeling myself against the treacherous pull of his presence. "Because I do not accept payment for services not yet rendered, Your Grace." The colour drained from his face. He knew instantly what I meant. "What have you seen?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I have seen the contract," I said, the words tasting like ash. "The one that barters my sister for my father's solvency. Was my family's ruin the price of your courtship, or was the courtship simply part of the purchase price?" I watched his face, wanting to see a flicker of guilt, of shame. Instead, I saw a deep, profound pain that mirrored my own. "The debt is real," he admitted, his voice strained. "It is an old, unfortunate business I inherited with the title. I came to Ferngrove to resolve it. That was my only intention." He took a step closer, his eyes pleading with me. "That was the plan. Everything else was a catastrophe I did not plan for. You, Eleanor, you were the catastrophe." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound agitation. "The debt was a problem to be managed, a distasteful piece of estate business. But from the moment I saw you at that assembly, kneeling on the floor with such quiet competence, you disrupted everything. You were not in the contract." He told me then that he had taken action. The day after our last walk, long before I had discovered the contract, he had visited my father. He had brought with him a new document, one that forgave the entire debt, unconditionally, with no strings attached. He had torn up the old agreement. "I could not, in good conscience, court a woman while holding her family in financial bondage," he said, his voice raw with sincerity. "I wanted to come to you freely. I wanted you to be free." My father, it seemed, had chosen not to share this crucial piece of information. preferring to maintain the leverage he thought he possessed. The gifts had not been payments. They had been apologies for a situation he had already rectified. They had been his way of speaking when words failed him. Julian stepped closer still, his hands clenched at his sides as if to keep from reaching for me. "For years," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense murmur, "I have lived in a grey world. After she was gone, the colour leached out of everything. My life became a series of duties, of obligations, of responsibilities to a title I never truly wanted. It was a long, silent winter." His gaze held mine, fierce and unwavering. "And then I saw you. You, with your quiet strength, your brilliant mind, your absolute refusal to be anything other than yourself. It was like seeing the sun for the first time. You did not bring the colour back into my world, Eleanor. You are the colour." He paused, his breath catching. "I came to your home to fulfill a tedious obligation, and I found a reason to live again. You have unmade me. You have rebuilt me. Every thought I have leads back to you. The debt, the contract, my title. None of it matters. Only you." Tears I had refused to shed now streamed down my face. All the pain, the humiliation, the bitter disappointment. It all washed away, replaced by a hope so fierce it was almost painful. He was not the man I had feared him to be. He was the man I had secretly, foolishly, dared to hope he was. He was telling me the truth. I could see it in the vulnerable line of his mouth, hear it in the shaking timbre of his voice. "I believed," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion, "that your kindness was a lie." "My kindness," he said, finally closing the distance between us, his hands coming up to gently cup my face, his thumbs wiping away my tears, "is the most honest thing about me, because it all comes from you." In that dusty, forgotten cottage, we formed an alliance. We were no longer a creditor and a debtor's daughter, but a man and a woman united against the machinations of a world that saw people as commodities. He told me of my stepmother's ambitions, of my father's desperation, and I listened, no longer a victim of their schemes, but a partner in defying them. The final act of this domestic drama was set, fittingly, upon a public stage. The Duchess of Devonshire was hosting her annual autumn ball, the pinnacle of the local social calendar. My family, of course, was attending. Beatrice saw it as the perfect venue to force the Duke's hand, to publicly cement the engagement she still believed was her right to claim. Unaware that her primary bargaining chip, the debt, had been rendered worthless, she was walking into an ambush of her own making. I wore a new gown, a gift from Julian, delivered that very afternoon. It was the colour of a midnight sky, a deep, starless blue, elegant in its simplicity. When I descended the stairs, my family stared. The dress was not the gown of a wallflower. It was the gown of a woman who expected to be seen. Rosamond looked at me with wide, surprised eyes, a flicker of something, admiration perhaps, in her expression. Beatrice's lips thinned into a disapproving line. "A bit bold for you, is it not, Eleanor?" "I no longer feel the need to apologise for taking up space," I replied quietly. The ballroom was a glittering galaxy of chandeliers, silks, and jewels. We made our entrance, Rosamond positioned at the front like the figurehead of a ship, me following in her wake. Julian was already there, a severe, handsome figure standing near the orchestra. His eyes found mine across the crowded room, a silent acknowledgement, a promise. Beatrice wasted no time. With the unerring instinct of a predator, she cornered him, dragging a reluctant Rosamond with her. She pitched her voice to be heard by those nearby, a performance for the gallery. "Your Grace," she trilled, her smile wide and predatory. "We are all so thrilled. The whole county is buzzing with the news. Shall we make a formal announcement of the happy union between you and my dear Rosamond?" A hush fell over the surrounding guests. All eyes turned to the Duke. This was the moment. He looked at Beatrice, his expression unreadable, then at Rosamond, whose face was pale with anxiety. Finally, his gaze swept over the crowd and landed, once again, on me. He took a deliberate step back from Beatrice, creating a small, definitive space between them. "Madam," he said, his voice calm and clear, ringing with an authority that commanded the attention of the entire room. "You are mistaken. There is no engagement between myself and Miss Rosamond Vance. There is not, nor will there ever be, any such arrangement." The collective gasp was audible. Beatrice's face contorted, shifting from triumph to confusion to pure, unadulterated fury. "What is the meaning of this? We had an agreement." Julian then turned his attention to my father, who was hovering nearby, looking ill. "Sir," the Duke said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "as we discussed and finalised weeks ago, all financial matters between our families are concluded. You are a free man, with no obligations to me whatsoever." He was dismantling their plot, brick by brick, in front of the very people they sought to impress. He was not merely denying the engagement, he was exposing its mercenary foundations. Humiliated, cornered, and stripped of all her power, Beatrice turned on the only target she had left. She whirled around and pointed a trembling finger at me. "You!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is your doing! You schemed for this, you plain manipulative little creature! You wormed your way into his affections behind our backs!" In the past, I would have shrunk. I would have withered under the heat of her rage, desperate to disappear. But the woman standing in the midnight blue dress was not that girl anymore. I stood tall, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I met my stepmother's hateful glare, not with anger, but with a profound and unshakable calm. "I have schemed for nothing," I said, my voice not loud, but carrying with perfect clarity in the stunned silence. "I have simply learned that a person's worth is not determined by what they can be sold for." I then looked at my sister, whose eyes were filled with tears of shame for her mother's outburst. "And I have learned that beauty is not a prize to be awarded, but a quality to be found in honesty and kindness and truth." It was over. The social execution was complete. My father guided my weeping stepmother from the room, their retreat a tableau of public disgrace. The whispers that followed them were merciless. Their ambition had led them to ruin, their downfall swift and absolute. Julian came to my side. He did not touch me, not yet, but his presence was a shield, a declaration. "Are you all right?" he murmured, for my ears only. I nodded, a slow, deep, and shaking breath leaving my body. I am now. He led me from the ballroom, away from the prying eyes and the buzzing gossip, out onto a cold stone terrace under a sky full of stars. The chilly air was a relief, washing away the cloying heat of the room. We stood in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the orchestra a faint, distant melody. "Come home with me, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to face me, taking my hands in his. "Not to Blackwood Manor, not to the title and the duties, just home, with me." And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, resonant certainty. It was the end of a long, painful silence, and the beginning of a beautiful conversation. It was a promise of firewood on cold nights, of shared books and quiet understanding. It was the feeling of being, at long last, completely and utterly seen. It was the feeling of coming home. 3 months later, we were married. The wedding was a quiet affair, attended only by a few trusted friends, and my sister, Rosamond. She had written to me after the ball, a long, heartfelt letter of apology. She had broken free from our parents' influence and was now living with a kind aunt in Bath, discovering for the first time who she was without the constant pressure of being a beauty for sale. Her happiness for me was genuine, and it healed a breach between us I had not realized was so deep. Blackwood Manor was not the dark, forbidding fortress of my imagination. With Julian, it was a place of light and warmth. The grand library, his former refuge, became our shared sanctuary. We spent our evenings there, sitting before a roaring fire, reading, talking, or simply enjoying the profound comfort of each other's presence. His severe facade had melted away, revealing a man of deep feeling, quiet humour, and unwavering integrity. His staff, particularly his formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, who had feared he would be lost to his grief forever, treated me with a fierce, protective affection. One evening, as a soft snow fell outside, blanketing the world in white, I was curled in a chair by the fire, wrapped in the green cashmere shawl I had long since reclaimed from the back of my wardrobe. Julian sat across from me, watching me with that same intense gaze that had first unsettled and then captivated me. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. I smiled, stroking the soft wool of the shawl. "I was thinking about gifts," I said, "and how I once believed your kindness came with invisible invoices." I looked from the shawl to the fire, burning so brightly in the hearth. "I thought this shawl was a brand, and the firewood a down payment. I was so wrong. They weren't transactions at all." "What were they then?" he prompted, his eyes full of love. "They were words," I replied, my voice full of a quiet, settled joy. They were the first words of a man who was unaccustomed to speaking of his heart. They were the beginning of our story. I looked at him, my husband, the man who had seen past my plain dress and quiet demeanour to the person I truly was. I had spent a lifetime feeling like a footnote in my own family story, a character in the background, out of focus. But he had walked into the room, and his gaze had been a clarifying lens, bringing me into sharp, brilliant focus. He had seen me, and in doing so, had taught me to finally see myself. I was not a problem to be solved. I was not an anchor. I was home. And so was he.